Hi everyone, this is Nian. Today I'm going to be painting a mini stone cottage. Back in spring, I painted a mini cottage, which is spring version, so this time I decided to do an autumn version. I'm going to start by sketching the main structure. I already know I want to have a tree next to the cottage, so here I'm placing the cottage on the right hand side, leaving a bit of space on the left, and I started by drawing out basic shapes like a square for the main part of the house, and then I added a guideline in the middle and also horizontally to know the midpoint for the roof as well as where the roof will end on both sides. I also wanted to include some arches because I feel like this would give more of a rustic sort of look. So I made an arch window at the top as well as an arch door. On the right hand side though, I decided to draw on a large square window because there's quite a large space and I just want to fill it in. As I'm roughly sketching, I also want to clean out the lines little by little once I'm happy with the position. So here, as you can see, I just erase certain areas a little bit at a time and clean out the lines. On the left side, I really wanted to include some autumn colors. I wanted the leaves to be red for the tree, and a vibrant red tree that I really like is the Japanese maple tree. There are so many colors actually, but I decided to pick red for this composition. I'm also going to add some plants as well as a few pumpkins in front of the cottage to give more of an autumn feel. By the way, here are some of the references that I used. I really like the small cottage look on the top reference, and I also wanted to have some green leaves that is covering the cottage itself to make it look very rustic and very woodsy. When I was searching around Pinterest, I also came across this painting by Gielleart, and it's basically a mix of the two reference images that I just showed you, and I love this painting so much, so my painting will have some influences from this work. If you guys don't know Gielleart, she does these very cute woodsy and children's book style paintings, and it's so beautiful. I'm so happy I came across this artist when I was looking for references, so don't forget to check out her paintings. I'll leave the link of her Instagram handle on the description box because I feel you guys would love it. Anyway, going back to the sketching portion of this, I'm going to add on the details like the window frames and also the panels on the door. I haven't really figured out what I was going to do, but I just want to indicate it at this point and figure it out later as I paint. I feel like the overall composition is a bit too low actually, so I wanted to extend it upwards by adding a little bit of smoke on top of the chimney. Here I wanted to add a bit more movement to the maple tree, so I decided to make the tree trunk a little bit more crooked. And here I'm just going to map out where I'm going to paint on the leaves very roughly. Once I'm done, I'm going to go over the colors really quickly. This is Indigo by Schmincke, Hooker's Green by Cotman, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, and Sepia by Holbein. I recently bought these brown pens, so I'm going to be using them. They're by Unipen, and they're fine line, waterproof, and fade proof. I'm going to start by painting the tree by using a mix of Quin Sienna and Quin Red. I'm painting the tree first because it's going to be covering part of the cottage, and if I paint it first, I don't have to worry about leaving space for the leaves. So generally, I like to paint things which are going to overlap or be in front of the larger items. For the texture of the leaves, I made more or less 3 brush strokes which comes together at the top, and I want those 3 brush strokes to somewhat flop down, and I'm just going to repeat the shape until I fill in the space that I sketched out earlier. When I was sketching it out, I made sure that I made different sections for the tree, and if there are overlapping areas for the leaves, then I would use a darker color which has a little bit of sepia in the mixture to separate those sections. When I'm doing this, I'm trying to think which area is in front and which area is at the back, and that is how I allocated the values. For areas which are at the back, I would use the darker value, and for the areas in front, which are most of the top part of the tree, and for this, I just used the mix of Quin Red and Quin Sienna in a thinner consistency for the lighter color. And I'm just going to repeat this a section at a time, making sure that as I paint the darker values, I'm still following the same type of brush strokes to create similar leaf textures. Another important note is when I'm painting the sections of the leaves, I want to make sure that the edges are uneven, so some areas drop down lower than others. This will make the placement of the leaves a little bit more organic and less bulky. I think I'm more or less done with the leaves here. I feel like I have a good amount and it's spread out fairly well across the tree. So I'm going to move on to paint the other plants using a mix of indigo and hooker's green in a light consistency to begin with. And I'm going to use this to paint the plant on the larger pot. For this, I made the texture kind of long, so it looks like long leaves which are flopped over. And I'm going to go back in while the surface is still a little bit damp with more indigo in the mixture for the darker values of this plant. As for the plant on the smaller pot, I'm going to do something similar, but for the color I added more yellow ochre, so I create a different tone of green. I'm starting with a light consistency, and as for the brush strokes, I'm doing little dots instead of the long lines to create a different texture. For the darker values, I use a slightly thicker consistency with more indigo in the mixture, and I'm going to place it on this plant while the surface is still a bit damp. Next, I'm going to paint the pumpkins. For the first one, I used a muted orange color from a mix of yellow ochre and Quin Red. And for the one in front, I'm going to create something lighter, which has more yellow ochre in the mix. And for the last one, I'm going to create something darker, so I used the same mixture, but I added sepia and Quin Sienna. For the bush on the right, I'm going to add some flowers. For this, I just used the same color as the tree to make the colors consistent. So this is from a mix of Quin Red and Quin Sienna. And I'm just painting on some 5-petaled flowers as well as some dots for smaller flowers. I'm going to leave that to dry and paint the wall plant. For this, I'm just using the greens that I already have on my palette, but I'm just going to add a bit of yellow ochre to make this more of a muted yellow-green. And I'm just going to play around with the consistency as well as the values to create the darker shadows later on. So obviously for the lighter ones, I'm going to use the mixture which has more yellow ochre in the ratio. And I'm also using a slightly thinner consistency. As for the darker values, I like to use a thicker consistency, and sometimes I like to also mix in more indigo in the ratio. In terms of the texture, I want this to look kind of thick, bushy, and puffy in a way. So I'm just creating dots or just small brush strokes, a similar texture to what I made for the small potted plant in front. To not make the bush look too thick and dense, also leave out a little bit of white negative space in between certain shapes. You don't have to do this completely intentionally, but as I'm creating the small dots or textures, I just naturally leave out a little bit of space and you don't have to fill it in. Once I'm done with the climbing plant, I'm going to paint the bush in front. I'm just going to use the same colors as well as the same method. You can see that some of the reds from the flowers are being pulled since I applied it using a thick consistency, so I am careful to paint around those flowers. As for the shadows, I'm going to use a thicker consistency of the same mix and place this under the flowers as well as under parts of the bush while keeping the edges nice and uneven to make the placement look more natural. After that, I'm going to finish it off by adding more flowers around parts of the bush so it looks like the flowers are crowding around the bush instead of it looking flat. Next, I'm going to paint the window frames as well as the door. For the color, I used a mix of Hooker's green, indigo, and yellow ochre, but I'm not going to put too much yellow ochre in the ratio. I want this to be mostly bluish green since I feel like this would make a nice contrast with the orangey brown color that I'm planning to paint for the exterior of the cottage. For the frames in the door, I'm using a medium consistency. This way I still can layer on more of the colors for the darker values of the details as well as the shadows. For the door, I decided to add some molding panels, so I'm just going to layer on the exact same color in a medium consistency again once the base color is completely dry, and I'm just painting on 2 rectangle shapes. Next, for the glass windows, I'm just going to use a very light consistency of indigo. For the tree trunk, I used a mix of yellow ochre with a bit of sepia to mute it, but after seeing this and editing this, I think that the color would be nicer if it's more muted. So if I were to do this again, I would use more sepia in the ratio instead of the yellow ochre. So the dark muted color will contrast the red leaves more. For the smaller branches though, I ended up going over certain areas with sepia just to darken it. I'm just using my normal brush here, but you can switch to a smaller brush when painting the small branches to make it easier to control. Next, I'm going to use a dry brush and I flatten the tip of my brush to paint some textures for the tree trunk. Next, I use a mix of sepia, yellow ochre, and Quin Sienna in a very thin consistency, and I'm going to use this to paint the base for the exterior of the cottage. Next, I'm going to move on to paint the roof. For the base of the roof, I used a mix of sepia and yellow ochre in a thin consistency. As for the roof itself, I'm going to use a medium consistency of sepia. I want to separate the wall from the roof, so here I'm using the base color of the wall again, just to create a line under the roof. I also layered on a bit of the darker green for the shadows of the plant, and I'm going to add a thin line for the base of the roof using a mix of yellow ochre and sepia for extra detail. Next, I'm going to paint the texture for the exterior. I'm starting with the brick or the stone frame around the top attic window. For this, I used a mix of sepia and Quin Sienna. I want the texture of the bricks or the stones to be somewhat uneven, so I'm just using my round brush here, but it is much easier to do this with a flat brush if you want it to be more even. Next, I'm going to paint the stones in different sizes for the exterior, and I'm also going to play around with the ratio, sometimes adding more sepia or Quin Sienna or yellow ochre a little bit more in the ratio to create different tones of browns. Generally, I'm using a light to medium consistency to paint those stones since I don't want the texture to be too strong. I'm also going to paint the pots using a mix of sepia and yellow ochre. For the shadows underneath the plants for the pot, I used the same mixture as the base color of the pot. And here for the detail of the door, for the nail and the door handle, I just use a thick consistency of sepia, and I'm going to paint on the details for the frames using the same mixture as the base color of those frames, but in a thicker consistency. You can also use a smaller brush to paint those darker colors in a thin line. Once the stone textures are completely dry, I'm going to go over the shadow underneath the roof again, using more sepia in the mix to darken those areas. And I'm also going to use a mix of sepia and Quin Sienna to paint around the window frames and the door. After painting most of the exterior of the cottage, I feel like I need to add the darker values for the greenery, so here I'm just layering on more of the same mixture. Then to add a bit of color, I'm just going to do very tiny red dots as berries. I'm also going to darken the area under the roof by using a medium consistency of sepia. Moving on to the chimney, I'm just going to treat this the exact same way as I did for the exterior of the cottage. So I'm starting with the base color, and I'm going to dry this completely before painting on the texture using the different tones of browns in a light to medium consistency. As for the top part of the chimney, I'm going to direct the stones or the bricks in the same direction vertically. I want to make sure it's dry between each layer, then I'm going to paint on the shadow underneath the top part of the chimney. For the stone walkway in front of the door, I'm just going to use the same browns that I already have on my palette. And next I'm going to paint the grass area. I still have a lot of greens that I still have on my palette, so I'm just going to use it. It's basically from a mix of focus green, indigo, and yellow ochre, and you can play around with the ratio. I'm first using a light to medium load to paint the base color, and then I dried it completely and painted the shadows for those walking stones. After that, I'm going to use the same green for the grass again and paint around those walking stones as well as under the bush, the tree, plants, and the pumpkins. For the smoke on the chimney, I kind of used the same color as the base of the cottage but with added yellow ochre, and I kind of layered it from a really thin consistency to medium consistency for certain areas to get a bit of dimension. And as for the fence, I just used a thick consistency of sepia. After that, I'm going to go back to the smoke on the chimney to add a little bit of the slightly thicker consistency around the edges, especially close to the chimney to make the smoke look more dense there. I realized I left out the pumpkins for some time now, so I'm just going to paint on the details using the exact same color but in a slightly thicker consistency, and if I want a darker value I would just add a bit of sepia in the mixture. I use a medium consistency to paint the ribs as well as some shadows underneath. Then as for the stem, I just use a thick consistency of sepia. I wasn't sure at this point if I wanted to add a background color or not, so I'm just going to outline some of the elements here to make the lines a bit clearer, especially for certain details like the base of the roof. You can also outline or add details using colored pencils. I think it'll look really cute for this style of painting, but personally, since I just got this pen, I wanted to try it out. I kind of went back and forth with the painting as well. I kind of forgot to paint on some grass texture, so here I'm using the grass mixture before with more indigo in the mix to make it a bit darker, and I paint on really small brush strokes to add a bit of uneven texture around the main features of this painting. For added color, I decided to add on red berries for the plant on the pot as well. I feel like adding shadows underneath some of the larger stones. I feel like this will be better done with watercolor and a brush to make it look a bit more fluid and loose, but I just want to finish off the painting, so I ended up lining the bottom part of some of the stones using my pen. After I'm done with the outline, I'm just going to clean out some additional pencil marks from the sketch, and this is when I kind of figured out I wanted to paint a background color, so I'm just using a really thin consistency of indigo because I feel like this will make a really nice contrast with the reds and the oranges of the painting. Since I am painting on a fairly thin paper here, this is only 200 GSM, I'm just going to use a hairdryer to dry everything off to get rid of the warp of the paper. And that's pretty much it for this painting. If you guys enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Please don't forget to check out Gielleart. And like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!